Hi everyone, my name is Sharmila, and in this video we will be talking about the motion, "This House would abolish marriage." So from proposition, it helps to be able to just give a working definition of marriage for the debate. That could be something like marriage is a legal, formal union between two people of a permanent nature, for example. And abolishing it means no longer allowing people to enter into this kind of relationship. So what prop can say instead as an alternative, because it's a very good idea then to be able to point people to alternative worlds, reimagining the world without marriage, right? They can say, look, the state can still allow people to sign individualized contracts over things such as inheritance, medical emergencies, property division, or managing their finances or child custody. But these are not all tied to a single person permanently. You can engage in these contracts with different people across your life, right? And multiple people at once, for example. And obviously, people can still get tax breaks for having children, but this does not have to be tied to marriage or to a permanent union, right? Now, in order to win, what proposition needs to do with a motion like this is to show that marriage as an institution is structurally, inherently harmful, so harmful that it should be disallowed and heavily, heavily discouraged, right? And that it is better to nudge people into other relationship formations. And so in proving this, these are some of the things we were thinking prop could do. So first, they can show that marriage as it is articulated, as it is practiced at the moment, is, and the debate is happening in the present, right, is inherently exclusionary to other relationships. No matter what you do, there will always be a hierarchy of relationships if marriage is on the table, right? First, it's just between two people, and sometimes actually only between men and women. And marriage is seen as more important than all other relationships, which is why the assumption of your spouse therefore has control over making decisions in medical emergencies, inherits your wealth, etc., etc. So it's put before your relationship with your initial family, your parents, your siblings, your friends, and other forms of relationship in your life. And in some cases, even ahead of your relationship with yourself and your own personal autonomy. So there are so many countries around the world that still don't recognize marital rape as a crime, for example, because the assumption is once you're married to someone, like they might be entitled to your body or to having sex with you. So marriage is kind of like this hegemonic relationship of people's lives, which is A, harmful and exclusionary. B, it's also like deeply tied to childbirth and child rearing, because that's how we choose to raise kids within a framework of marriage. Even if this is already unhealthy, and even if it might be better for extended family to get involved in raising the child, or for someone else to actually have custody or rights over the child, there's always a presumption in favor of the married couple. But there's no reason why, just because they were married and they had kids, they immediately are better for raising those kids. So what we should be doing instead is encouraging individuals to explore a wide range of relationships that work for them. If it is better to raise your child with your parents or with your sibling or with friends, then maybe that is what we should be encouraging people to do. If they are finding more social and emotional support from particular friendships, then maybe that's what we should be encouraging them to prioritize instead of immediately the default being marriage. Second, existence of this institution on its own is already coercive. There are very strong social expectations that everyone enters into it. It's seen as a milestone of adulthood. So people don't even sometimes have the opportunity to reflect on the opportunity costs of entering into marriage, or to reflect on whether this is something they want, this is something that will make them happy. They are expected to enter into it, right? And so I think prop can spend a lot of time characterizing what that coercion looks like and providing examples of that, right? And once people are married, they're encouraged to get financially and economically entangled. They're encouraged to become dependent on each other. And because we exist in a world that is still quite sexist in terms of economic opportunities, what usually happens is women get stuck with the child carrying, child rearing responsibilities and domestic responsibilities that are heavily undervalued. And then they become dependent on their male partners as a trend. And this is not true of all couples, but it's on aggregate true. And this dependence is actually actively encouraged under the institution of marriage. And because of that, even if people might want to leave, they can't because it's too late. They've already invested their lives in this, and there's no real fallback, right? And so even in cases of abuse, people have a hard time leaving because of this dependence that prop can build on and discuss, but also because it's in many cases seen as socially unacceptable to walk away from a family and wreck a family, in this case, a family in the context of a nuclear family, right? So there's this illusion of happiness that is attached to marriage that's not really questioned in most circles, even if there are like fringe countercultures against this. On balance, this is still hegemonically accepted as an expectation for everyone. And second, a lot of people's conceptions of respectability are tied to being married. So a woman who is unmarried, it's seen as there's something wrong with her. It's seen as she is engaging in unacceptable sexual behavior, or she's kind of a target for violence because she doesn't have a man protecting her. And is likely to experience pressure and disapproval even from her own family. So that's some of the material that the strongest material that prop can build on. And on the basis of that, it's just not enough to, mildly discourage it, but it's actually necessary to just abolish the institution. On OP, and OP has to do some recharacterizing here because obviously there are problems with marriage and OP can't pretend that this doesn't exist, right? So what OP can do here is to say, look, obviously, marriage is not perfect, but it has also evolved over time, right? And we support the trend towards, it's a policy debate, we support the trend towards more inclusive formations of marriage. So obviously expanding it to same-sex situations, and making sure that marriage between different nationalities is easier so that the power imbalance between, someone who has a visa and someone who doesn't have a visa is minimized. Obviously support couples reflecting on a more diverse conception of what a good marriage might look like. For some people, that might look like a semi-open marriage. For some people, that might look like, a divorce at the end of like 10 years, maybe. So considering these alternative conceptions of what a good marriage looks like, making divorce more accessible, definitely cracking down on domestic violence and providing support to domestic violence victims, obviously cracking down on forced marriage, and obviously ensuring that women have access to reproductive and sexual rights so that they have control over the timing and the spacing of their children, increased like enforcement of parental leave and encouraging both parents to take leave so that this burden doesn't just fall on the women. Obviously, you support legislation that counters employment discrimination. So a lot of the harms of OP, you argue, are being mitigated or kind of because of the way society is organically evolving also are not as bad as they're saying anymore. And then I think you have to establish an OP that people are actually able to consent into this. Like marriage is no longer the only option on the table. More and more people are also choosing to be single or to marry later in life or to divorce their partners if they're unhappy. I mean, in some countries, the statistic is actually 1 out of every 2 marriages, right? So the bottom line is, this is not something that people do without thinking about it. But having said that, it is an institution that is worth preserving and actually worth encouraging, worth normalizing, not in a coercive way, but in a soft nudge kind of way. And especially to some people, it's an institution that is actually particularly valuable. So keeping in mind that that's what, that's a broad strategy on OP, that's what OP needs to prove in order to win the debate. Some of the things OP can say here are, 1, marriage is just structurally a better way of organizing social life. Obviously, we will have exceptions here and there. Obviously, if someone is incredibly violent or a murderer, we will not be prescribing that their partner stay with them, right? But on balance, and the data does show this, married people are happier and live longer lives. They also sleep better. Also, the predictability and permanence of marriage provides a cushion against risk. So there are certain groups of people who are more vulnerable to absorbing most of the risk if we didn't have the structure of marriage. So think about how much easier it would be for people to walk away from responsibility or from if marriage didn't exist as an institution. So in some ways, women who end up having children, they become a bit more exposed to risk, or they become more vulnerable to being easily left without the institution of marriage. So in some ways, you can even think of it as a security blanket. But the other way of thinking about it is just from a purely incentive structure perspective. And here you can draw on insights from behavioral economics, from nudge theory, which is when people are primed to think of something as permanent and they formalize that, they put their commitment to it, right? That kind of becomes part of their identity. They internalize the idea that it is permanent and it's a long-term commitment. Not in the absolute coercive way that the proposition is characterized. So you have to push back against that and say, obviously, there are enough counter discourses as well, incentives to leave bad marriages. But for as long as the marriage is going well, or it's not too bad, there is an incentive to stay, and people are oriented towards that. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That makes them invest more in the relationship. That makes them think about things like, where will we live? What is our work-life balance, right? How will we raise children? Because you see a future with this person, which is really ultimately the best way still of structuring and organizing social life. It's also a more economically efficient way of distributing resources, like people buying property, people joining up and pooling their resources together. That actually makes things more affordable for them, like housing, for example. And it is still the best framework for child rearing, because it's true, grandparents can pitch in, friends can help out, etc., etc. But it does help to have two people who are directly responsible permanently for the welfare of those children, and making important decisions when decisions do have to be made. Like, you can't keep doing individualized contracts and like changing these contracts over time. And that instability is very unhealthy for children as well. And that is quite chaotic and messy. It's difficult to adjudicate in that situation in the way that it becomes easier in the context of marriage, right? So the hierarchy in social relationships is valuable. And I think that's something you have to be willing to defend. Or not. The next thing is just a freedom argument. We are abolishing this. And I think there is a very rich line on the opposition side to say, oh no, but this arrangement might be the preference of some people. And it is undemocratic to simply dismiss that, right? Some people might prefer an arrangement where they formalize things permanently for religious or cultural reasons, but also because their sense of security is tied to that. Because in some cases for women, before you are willing to make certain sacrifices, because yes, we do live in a patriarchal world potentially, but that's your choice to make. You want to know that it's secure. You want to know it's within a framework that's permanent. Or people who make decisions like moving somewhere to be with someone, or choosing to raise a child with someone. If you didn't think that this was happening within the context of a permanent relationship, you would actually hesitate. It would actually lead to relationships becoming more unstable through no fault of the people, because the state is not allowing them to use all the pre-commitment devices at their disposal that they're willing to use. So if the goal of the proposition side is to, curb the harms of marriage, we don't think those harms are inherent or structural. We've shown that that marriage is an institution that evolves over time. So our efforts should be targeted at democratizing marriage, at making sure that it's a product of informed consent, of making sure that people think more carefully before jumping into it. Fair enough, but that doesn't mean we take that option away, because that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, pun not intended. Because what that does then, it makes it hard for people to make decisions with that sense of security that they can count on their partner to still be there with them tomorrow when they take all these risks that we do need them to take. Otherwise, no one's going to have kids. No one's going to invest in a house. No one's going to, build roots anywhere, because they're afraid that their partner might be gone tomorrow. So I think that might be a direction that OP can take. Or also the more sentimental argument of, for some people, the idea of forever is a source of happiness and is a source of peace. And the role of the state is to facilitate people's access to the good life, not to tell them what that good life is, right? Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and I hope you enjoyed your debates.